I wasn't thinking about windows, I wasn't thinking about architecture or anything like that at all. And the first piece I did was a piece that just hung on the wall like a painting and had relief elements in it of wires that were bent, an abstract work. The early pieces were all like that. Using backlighting was a problem for me because these weren't windows, and it was a question of how to look at them rather than just hanging them like a trinket in a window. Then I went through a series of pieces that hung in front of windows like everybody else did. And when I had my first exhibition in '76, I actually built light boxes and installed them in that. And the takeaway from that experience was these are awfully cumbersome and a difficult way of showing it, and it's not viable as an independent form. So that evolved into showing the works on stands that were individually mounted. And when I had a show at the Soria Gallery in San Francisco in the early '80s, some of the works just hung flat on the wall, were meant to be seen with reflected light. Other ones were in stands that stood out a little bit from the wall, so lights could be bounced off the wall and they'd get illuminated. But I was unhappy even with that, the cumbersomeness of it and the difficulties. And gradually it evolved to where the pieces were meant to hang just flat on the wall. And I had a number of stained glass panels that had transparent glass that hung on the wall, and you'd see the shadows through the transparency projected onto the wall. And it was at that point that I started really breathing and feeling comfortable with the material, because I had it where I wanted it, and it was a question of where I was going to go from there. My interests have always been with drawing. I probably spend more time with the drawings than with the actual panels that came out of them. That's where the labor is. And the drawings ultimately look very different from the panels, because in my drawings you have that palimpsest of erased lines and painted over lines. The panels themselves almost become a little cartoonish in terms of the clarity of the forms. Eventually, the final form grows out of that and becomes what it is. So when you see a panel, you don't see the history of what's gone into it the way you see it in the drawing. The panel is what's extracted from the drawing. In the drawings, it's an evolving process. The whole thing is in process, and it never really fully resolves. And that's always a big issue as to when a drawing is finished. The painter Adolf Gottlieb had a line about that when a critic once asked him, "How do you know when one of your paintings is done?" And Gottlieb's response was, "Well, I ask my wife." I don't say autonomous panel. I don't like the term autonomous. I think it's mildly derogatory. You'd never call a painting an autonomous painting, and I don't think you should ever call a panel an autonomous panel. It's a thing per se, and it's not the handmaiden of architecture. It has nothing to do with architecture, and the best panels aren't architectural. I can spend a month working on a drawing. I've spent several months on individual drawings, sort of reaching a point where they're resolved or where I'm happy with them. It's relatively cerebral because I'm thinking about balance, I'm thinking about motion, I'm thinking of where things are moving. But it's also visceral because sometimes you'll erase and, strike or do something, and that becomes something you're reacting to. I look very hard. When I walk with people, I often notice things that other people don't notice. I think there are two parts to looking. There's seeing to begin with, and then you have to look hard to discover what's really pleasing. When I'm working, I can sit for a long time and just look at a blank canvas to begin to see it. And then maybe sometimes I'll draw a line and sit and look at that line. Put lines on, erase lines, paint them over, add other lines. Things get layered on top of layered upon top of layers. All a part of thinking what's there and trying to find things that are aesthetically pleasing. I started sandblasting. I have a big piece quartet that's just plate glass that's sandblasted and leaded and painted some that hangs on the wall. From there, it evolved into other hybrid forms of working with glass. So they started out with a sheet of hand-blown glass that I'd very carefully select for the shading in them and what was happening in the shading. And I would sandblast them on the front and on the back. And what I realized is the wonderful aspect of glass when it's hanging on the wall is it has the ability, particularly when sandblasted, to trap the light in it. So it looks like you're getting the light from behind that you get with stained glass, but you're getting it from the front. So you can light it from the front, you can hang it on the wall, and it will still glow. From there, I moved on to sandblasting sheets of glass and drawing behind it. Here I found a way of being able to incorporate the glass, the light, with the drawings and have a dialogue back and forth between drawing and sandblasted glass sheets. And that evolved further into using more active hand-blown sheets with a bubble, sometimes a single bubble, sometimes a single streak in it. I'd spend hours and hours down at the glass houses just trying to find a piece of glass that I could get a piece out of that would have the kinds of things I wanted going on in it. And the light comes through them and projects the bubble, the streak, or whatever is happening in the glass on the drawing behind it. The works themselves would then become dialogues between drawing and glass because I'd sandblast, set it up, look at it, respond in the drawings, look again, respond in the glass, respond in the drawings, going back and forth. That work went through the 80s into the 90s. More recently, I've gotten into mosaic. The tesserae, the individual pieces of glass, are hand cut, and clear adhesive is used to put it on top of a drawing so the underdrawing comes through. Now I had found a way where I could incorporate the actual drawing with the glass. Really where the interest lies, for me, in art in general, is in the meaning, in what lies beyond the surface. If I were to try and describe who I am, and I hope that my art is who I am, there are certain characteristics, not all of them are good, that I think the art express. Very meticulous, almost compulsive, like the later mosaics, cutting every piece of glass and doing that appeals to, that very meticulous side of myself. I'm a very neat worker. I always admired Seurat, who painted with white gloves. I'm not one of these guys who gets in there and slops it all over, and I hate getting messy and so on. And, lots of my friends love that. I mean, that's why they're in it, to get their hands in there and move it around. I used to do a lot of talks about my work and discuss them. At some point in life, that stopped being interesting to me. It was like, if it doesn't do it without me, it doesn't really need me. I came to feel somewhat uncomfortable with that. I don't know, maybe it's just with age, kind of withdrawing in a little bit or whatever, but if someone doesn't see it, if someone doesn't get it, nothing I'm going to tell them is going to help them, I don't think. And usually if they're inviting me to talk about it, they already get it. My dual career as critic and artist has not been very good professionally. I think I would have done far better as artist, not as critic. I mean, I was an arrogant kid and didn't hold my punches. I have no regret about doing it. I think it was done with honesty and sincerity, but it did not help the other profession. At the time when I started writing about stained glass, there was nothing really written about it in this country other than descriptive things. No one really got beneath the surface. For me, it was a chance to really help myself and help my colleagues on in the world by having some literature, by someone thinking about, by opening the dialogue. Bob Sowers was definitely a presence and a big influence, and personally, for me, very important. And he was the first one to bring the Germans over here and write about them. But he was entirely architectural. Sowers and I had interesting, often public disputes. I remember writing an article on stained glass as a non-architectural art, because, you know, his book is Stained Glass and Architectural Art. And you know, he wrote back and said, touche, and, you know, and we got into it. I mean, we were collegial and liked one another. I've always regarded my own work as abstract, as distinct from non-representational. They're abstract representations of thoughts, emotions, states of being, people, places, and the like. And I don't think it's very helpful to talk about that. People see it and sense it, and there's not much I can say. I mean, it's really a visual statement and not a verbal statement. Ultimately, what it comes down to is what looks good to me. I guess the long and the short of it is there are no hard and fast rules about beauty, about what's pleasing, about what works. It either does or it doesn't. The art does convey something more than simply what it looks like on its surface.